Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Gulsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science. Hey, Steve.
Steve.
Ranella.
I totally missed that reference.
Yeah. Like, oh man, you got the wrong name again.
I thought you were making a play on Steve Ditchkoff for some reason.
Yeah. Your colleague next door to you.
Yeah.
That's funny. No, yeah, I think it's funny, and we have continued to see a couple of comments here and there about you sounding like Steve Ranella. So
have you seen more
Still
of them?
An open invite. Still an open invite, Steve.
Yeah. Or if he wants to pay me to voice double for him, that'd be some nice side income.
Oh man, you could like read off the infomercials or something.
I could do his audiobook for him. He writes a lot of books, and I assume that they have an audio only version, so I could just do that for him.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. I guess nobody wants me to read their book for them.
I don't know. I think you have a soothing voice, Marcus.
Yeah, well, I've heard that a time or two. I've also
which is good because you're a dad, so it should come in handy.
I've seen a couple of comments that also sound like a redneck trying to do biology.
You've seen that?
Yeah.
Oh man, that's harsh.
Yeah. We've gotten a few negative comments. In a couple of places. I think that one was on YouTube.
Well, if they don't like my voice or my sense of humor, they probably should quit listening because I can't change them.
You've been working on it for a while.
38 years.
Yeah.
I did get one listener comment about Harper's voice, and the guy, it was like something to the effect of, man, I'm from the deep South, and I won't give him away because he told me his actual geography, and he was like, but Craig seems country even to me. And I was like, you hadn't been around too many hill people, have you?
Yeah.
That's that Western North Carolina hillbilly accent.
Yeah, it's pretty thick,
and it's not a put on.
No, I've known him for almost 20 years, and it's been consistent.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted to do a couple of things. One, I know you got some really cool stuff going on, and it dawned on us that we're trying to give updates on these projects, and we haven't given updates on the ones we have.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to do that today with you, and then we're working on getting one of the other folks involved in the Florida study on to talk about that one. But before we get going on that, there's a few questions that have been rising to the surface that I thought maybe we should to talk about for a second, if you want to do that.
Yeah, cool.
One of them, I know you've gotten it because you've been sending me stuff about it. I get it a lot, and it was stemming, I think, mainly from Brett Collier's recent episode. And a lot of people have been asking about the predation and what about before the hen is actually incubating, what's happening during that laying period with predation. Because for folks out there, if you're not really in tune with the hen's biology, essentially she starts laying, and she's laying an egg at a time and then going to the roost. So she's leaving the nest, not protecting the eggs, in other words,
for a couple
she's already
weeks.
Laid. Yeah, for a couple weeks. So, she's coming each day to tend it for a little while, but she's spending a lot of time away from it. So several people, and I think it's a really good comment, in question. Several people have been asking, okay, that's fine. Raccoons, maybe they're not pushing hens off if they're defending it during incubation, but what about during that laying period? So I was curious if you want to talk about that for a minute. I think that's a really good question and something we should definitely circle back around to with Brett and others that have experience doing that. But I was just curious, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts?
Yeah. So if it's still in the laying phase, then presumably those eggs that she's laid thus far are still viable, and that would constitute predation. That's not
Yeah.
scavenging. The reason that Brett was considering it scavenging post abandonment for whatever reason, the hen got depredated,
Mm-hmm.
then that's considered scavenging because she's no longer there to incubate the eggs, right?
Yeah. So it's distinctly different during incubation. The hens, they're defending the nest. Maybe a coyote comes and eats her. That's obviously predation. But then if we assign the nest loss to whatever eats the eggs, let's say raccoon shows up after the hen's already been depredated, then we would call it, we might misinterpret that situation as raccoon predation on the nest, when
Yeah.
indeed that is hen predation by a coyote in that example, right? And
But
then
in
that
that,
could be for a variety of things that, maybe something else, maybe a deer runs through, or, who knows? Lots of things could happen that could
yeah,
flush that hen away. And then if we don't know that happened and something follows up and finds a little nest full of eggs and eats all of them, well, that's scavenging, not predation. That's what he really was trying to make that point strong, that
right.
that we don't know how much that's happening,
Yeah,
but we know it's some.
yeah,
But that, I think that's a perfect thing from our audience and you guys that are giving us all these comments and stuff. Like, hopefully, you're seeing that you're influencing what we're putting on the air
right.
here. I think we've addressed quite a few things now that people are bringing up, but that's one that's super consistent. I'm just getting that question a lot.
So, hypothetical question for you, Marcus. If you're running a study and you were able to ascertain, all these pieces of this puzzle that we're talking about right here,
Mm-hmm.
and a coyote came along and ate the hen, those eggs are lost, right? So, in your data set, what do you write down as the fate of that nest?
I think that I would call it coyote depredation on the hen, and that's the way I would tag
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I was thinking about that as you were discussing it. And like in the nest fate model that would, result once all those data are in, I think there's an argument to be made too that that's a nest lost due to predators still,
Yeah, yeah,
because the
that's the
predator
way.
was the ultimate cause.
I think the problem enters in, and it's not the fault of the researchers, but we've gone through a long stint where we didn't necessarily have the technology to know
Hmm.
what
Yeah.
happened to the hen,
Yeah. And that's an
or
important
at least
point.
not in a reasonable time frame to know that the nest fate
Yeah.
wasn't, due to whatever came and scavenged. It
Right.
was actually due to some other factor like that.
Yeah, technology's brought things a long way, and one of the things that it improved technology has brought to the table is that we catch this nesting activity oftentimes earlier on than we did in the past with just VHF telemetry. You know, as compared to the GPS. But as you and I were talking about this morning, to my knowledge, one piece of data that we still don't have is what I've never seen it in a published report where it says, and if somebody's aware of it, please, as always, send us the paper.
Yeah, I
But I
think
don't,
we've established if you send us stuff,
yeah,
we're going to cover it.
yeah,
Like,
but I
we're not turning away good data here.
don't ever remember reading a paper that said, X percent of nests were lost prior to incubation and Y percent were lost once incubation had begun. Do you ever remember reading that?
Mm-mm.
So that's the problem with those questions that we've been getting from a lot of listeners is I
Well, and
don't
to be
really know.
fair, I wasn't looking for it either.
Yeah,
Yeah, but go ahead.
right. I mean, I wasn't looking for it either, but we really don't know in their hypothetical scenario, talking about, what about the eggs that are lost prior to incubation? I mean, I really don't know how often that happens.
Yeah, I think that's an important question to be asking. We probably have data being collected. Well, I think we do have data being collected where we could get at that question.
Mm-hmm.
With the GPS tags that we have today, I think we could have a pretty good idea during the laying phase if the hen, I guess, stops coming to it. But see, then I guess it would be predation either way then, because let's say that this hen's laid 4 eggs and she goes to the roost and a raccoon stumbles in and finds those 4 eggs and eats them, and then she basically abandons that nest site as a
Mm-hmm.
result of that. Well, that would still be predation.
Yeah.
So I have seen, uh, I was looking at it just real quick. I did see Dr. Collier address this somewhere online.
Okay. Well, while you're looking that up, I'll share one other thing that
Yeah.
I responded in a lot of those I responded with to a lot of those messages that I got from listeners, and that's that it is important to keep in mind that I think what Brett was really trying to convey in that interview is that we need to think about predation differently and understand that that some of this nest loss is scavenging. Not all of it is
Yeah.
direct predation. That's the important point, and that we don't have the data yet to assign what percentage of nests are lost prior to the hen being killed versus
Yeah.
not, you know.
I think really he's challenging us to challenge assumptions, right?
Right.
Realize that we're making assumptions and to challenge those to make sure that they are rigorous.
Yeah.
And, that's an important part of all this. And I think that's what he was trying to accomplish. I did find where he actually addressed this directly, and he may have done this in multiple places, but it's on Instagram. They Turkeys for Tomorrow posted, helping us promote the podcast. They
Mhm.
posted a reel from that episode with Collier, and they someone asked a question related to what we're talking about, and he said generally talking about the nest being susceptible during the laying period. He wrote on, in response to that question on their post. So if you want to look at this, go to Turkeys for Tomorrow's Instagram page where he did this. He said generally they are not. In other words, the nest is not susceptible to predation during the laying period. He said the loss rate was less than 1% during laying. Now, he didn't say where that data was coming from. We know that he's involved in a whole bunch of studies and a lot of nesting work.
Mhm.
So I don't know. We can ask him, or you guys can reach out to him if you're interested in the audience. Reach out to him and ask him about that. But he did say that it seems to be relatively minor based on the information he's pulling from.
Yeah. It shocks me that it would be that low.
Yeah, that seems really low, and I'm curious where he's getting that from.
Yeah.
Um, if we've got a hen on the hen laying, well, then there's so many issues to think about here, right? Like, okay, well, if she starts laying and 2 days in, a raccoon finds it,
Mhm.
well, she's going to move on. We wouldn't have even necessarily picked that up in the high frequency GPS data.
Yeah.
So that nesting attempt would have gone unnoticed.
Mhm.
So, yeah, very interesting question. I'm glad folks out there are really thinking. That's what we're trying to do here, is trying to get everybody to be thinking about this conversation critically. And I think our audience is showing us, by and large, a lot of folks are doing that. So that's
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, so there was a really interesting data point that I wanted to pull in from one of my students that just finished up an artificial nest study in Alabama, and it kind of speaks to this question where, we simulated these nests. We used unwashed chicken eggs. We placed them out in nest bowls in places that were systematically distributed around the landscape, and we kind of made them look like we made sure that they were in locations that we thought a hen would choose to place her nest, right, based on the literature. And we found that the first year when we didn't cover those eggs with anything, which looks exactly like a situation that a predator would run into if the hen was still in the laying period or if she had been predated herself. We found that we had an overall nest predation rate of 16%. So not that high.
16% of the nests, the simulated nests, were lost in the 2 weeks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's not high at all.
Yeah. I would have thought it would have been more. But yeah, over a 2-week period, just nests sitting out there on the landscape, I thought it would be more than that. And I guess one caveat I should throw out is this was in the Southern Appalachians in a closed canopy, pretty much closed canopy system.
Mm-hmm.
So not the place that I would key in on if I, wanted to win a trapping contest. Exactly. There's just not a lot of prey available there. So probably not a high predator context either.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what about when you covered them? Did that change it?
It actually went up.
You had more nest predation?
Yeah, we lost 35% the following year when we covered the nest, and we used burlap that we had aged outdoors for several weeks prior to using it. So it was fairly scent free, and we handled it with gloves, to make sure that we weren't contaminating it, because that's obviously a material that would absorb a lot of human scent if you touched it. But yeah, and
That kind of makes me think that is it a visual cue?
mhm.
Did the covering provide a visual cue? Well,
It shouldn't have, because it was
this,
just like brown burlap,
yeah.
And maybe
I mean,
we should
surely
do.
the eggs would.
I mean, we could do an entire breakout episode on this study because it had some really interesting results. But the other thing that I guess as we're getting into it as far as we are that I was going to bring up too is that consistent with some of what, well, I guess not entirely consistent with what Dr. Collier had said, but um, we found that gray foxes took more nests than anything else.
Mm-hmm.
And possums were next, coyotes were after that, and raccoons, man, raccoons were number 4 on the list.
Hmm.
We didn't have a lot of corvid predation. Only 5 nests were taken by American crows. Wild pigs took 4. Striped skunks took 1. Anyway, just
That's really
I thought an
interesting.
interesting
Yeah.
tidbit that kind of fit into this conversation, but I know
Well,
we're not here today to go in depth on that.
yeah. Well, we do want to go into an overview of some of your ongoing work, and this was some that just finished up.
Sure.
So I think we're still on task with that.
Right.
But if you want to hear us go into detail about that study, then send us several messages. If we get a bunch of them, we'll do it.
So I like how you said several.
Yeah, send them all to at Will Gulsby. Dr. Will Gulsby, what's your Instagram handle?
Something like that.
Yeah, Dr. Will Gulsby. Okay. Well, I think that's a good segue. Let's talk about the ongoing work, because I think you've got some stuff that's really, really cool.
Yeah.
So you want to start out by telling us the scope of what you got going on,
Yeah,
who's
sure.
involved with it, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. We got this rolling a couple years ago, and I have Turkeys for Tomorrow and the Alabama Wildlife Federation to thank for really getting the ball rolling on it. But I also want to mention that the state chapter of NWTF, the Alabama chapter, has come in a big way, and they've been a big supporter of this work as well. In addition,
So another example where Turkeys for Tomorrow and the Wild Turkey Federation are co-contributing to a study.
Yeah.
Very cool.
You gotta love it. I mean, coming together for turkeys, right?
Yeah, that's what they should be doing.
Yeah. So, man, the scope and scale of this thing has just continued to increase over time. Thanks to the generosity of a lot of these funding organizations, as well as increasing amount of data coming out highlighting the importance of a number of issues that we have very little data on. And so when it initiated, I guess you want me to take you back to the beginning, Marcus?
Please. Yeah, take me back to when I was a boy.
When it initiated, Mike Chamberlain had already been discussing placing out some song meters, also known as autonomous recording units. A lot of times we call them gobble recorders.
Yeah, I call them sound boxes.
Sound boxes, I like that.
Yeah, That's because of where I came from in Alabama.
Well, there's always ecologists that call trail cameras camera traps. Can we call these sound traps?
Yeah. Well, it probably should be called one
Let's call them
to be
sound
more
traps. I'll
consistent.
trademark that. But
I mean,
anyway,
soundbox is pretty good,
yeah,
but then you don't know if it's emitting sound or collecting
that's
it.
true.
Maybe it does both.
I call them speakers where I come from. But Mike had already been talking. It was actually to the hunting public
Mm,
because on their turkey tour, I think they pretty regularly stop by Alabama, and they filmed a research episode with Mike over there in Georgia. And they were like, "Well, what is something that we could do to contribute to wild turkey research?" And to their credit, they started a fundraiser that generated enough money for him to put out. I think the initial number they came up with was like 30 or 40 of those ARUs
mm-hmm.
to be placed on public lands throughout the state of Alabama. It's similar to a lot of the other gobbling work that Mike has done elsewhere. And so when that started getting spun up, Mike reached out to me and he was like, look, this is something that looks like it's going to happen. Well, at first, actually, we were like, because they were trying to crowdsource the funding from their followers. And when he first reached out to me, he was like, I don't know how this is going to go. It may work, it may flop, but it exceeded expectations and they were able to come up with the requested funding amount that he had established as the necessary level to get this rolling. And in the meantime, I'd already been talking to TFT and
Mm-hmm.
Alabama Wildlife Federation about doing some turkey work. And we were in deliberations at that point. I had thrown a bunch of ideas of things that I thought that were important to address across the state. And we were still kind of sorting through all that, figuring out the process of exactly what we were going to do. And we saw that the ARUs that Mike had gotten presented a pretty powerful opportunity to partner with them and increase the number of sites that were included in that aspect of the study, to try to leverage that out and also add in additional objectives. So their
Mm-hmm.
initial plan was to place these all out on wildlife management areas, and we added to that paired private lands throughout the state. The initial plan was to have a paired, what we considered intensively managed, relatively large private tract paired with each wildlife management area in North, Central, and South Alabama. And the concept behind that from an experimental framework is that it would allow us to start collecting some of that important data on private lands, as you and I have discussed several times
Mm-hmm.
on the air, and to look at gobbling chronology from North to South Alabama, which of course is important because we're starting to have all these discussions around season dates, and hunters want to
Mm-hmm.
hunt when birds are gobbling. And so, a key piece of information to have before you start manipulating season dates is how is this going to affect hunters' opportunity to hear gobbling activity, and then ultimately, hopefully, harvest a gobbler, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So we had those aspects already involved in the study. And then, we're definitely going to analyze the data in that way. But another thing that we're really interested in looking at as well, using that gobbling data, is, gobbling activity habitat associations.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably no surprise to many of our listeners that that's probably the part that excites me the most at this point in time. And I've seen some work actually recently published that came out of the upper Midwest where they had these units placed around in different areas of the state, and I actually did an Instagram post about it a little while back if you guys want to dig back through and try to find that. But they were able to ascertain that there were different habitat related limiting factors in different regions of the state.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that was a very actionable, valuable piece of information to have from that study.
Yeah, that's really cool. What the study in South Carolina that's it's not been published yet, I think, but the thesis
Yeah, I think I've just looked at the thesis.
was wasn't that something similar where there
Yes.
was a gobbling
Yeah.
habitat association analysis in that?
Yeah, that's one of the ones that we've kind of pulled in. It's not as direct evidence of the lack of early successional cover affecting turkey populations as some
Yeah,
of these Mark 10 studies, but they did find that I think it was got were they looking at occupancy? Was that the response variable?
yeah. I don't know that we need to get in the weeds on that, but they
It was
essentially
gobbler site use. was
Yeah.
strongly correlated with the amount of open cover types that were present in the area
Right.
surrounding a song meter.
Yeah, and that when they put it all together, I think that's when they came up with the single digit proportion of the
Mm-hmm.
landscape.
Right.
In that systematically
Yeah.
random sampling design.
Yeah.
So, several percent. It was I
Right.
don't remember it was a single digit number,
Yeah.
was early succession.
So we plan to, because my lab does have a strong habitat focus, try to take that a step further. And so we're going to be looking at gobbling activity habitat associations at a large spatial scale and then a finer spatial scale.
hmm
And so at the large spatial scale, for our listeners, primarily what we'll be looking at is within an area that is likely to encompass an actual, breeding population of turkeys. So, potentially over several thousand acres. What does that landscape and land use composition look like? So here's where you're thinking about proportion hardwood, proportion pine, proportion mixed,
hmm
proportion open, and you can further break that open down into various categories, whether it be low intensity development or pasture, cropland, and things like that. And so that's kind of the big picture analysis. And then
hmm
at the finer scale, within an area immediately surrounding one of these song meters, we're going to be doing some intensive vegetation sampling to look at what the actual plant communities look like in these areas that these gobblers are using, that could potentially translate into some actionable information as well.
hmm Yeah, that's a really cool part of the study. I know we've talked about it, but we have some similar things that we can bring to light from the Florida work as well.
Hmm.
There's some similarities here, which is great. And there probably are with some of these other projects that we're going to get people on to talk about.
Yeah, and I think over the coming years we're going to start throwing all these data sets into a common pool for analysis too, and
hmm
that'll make them even more powerful. And Brett and Mike in particular have already done a good bit of that by pooling their data across their study sites across the southeastern region and some even beyond that.
hmm Yeah, exciting times for turkeys and turkey research,
Hmm.
turkey conservation. So, okay, you've talked about the song meters. I know you're also doing some trapping, right? And you've
Hmm.
also had the hunter harvest contributions.
Yeah,
Let's start with that. So tell us about that part of the study.
the hunter harvest part.
Yeah.
Yeah, so one of the things that both Turkeys for Tomorrow and the Alabama Wildlife Federation were really interested in is this question of male fertility, right? Because
Mhm.
I'm not going to belabor this, but just as a brief recap, I think a lot of our listeners are already aware that there's a, say, candidate hypothesis out there. Well, actually, let me back up. I think we have some pretty solid data from a couple states. It's old, but it's fairly solid that shows that there are indeed a handful of males in turkey populations that dominate the breeding opportunity, right?
And how
Um,
do they show that?
so
Like genetically?
I'm primarily basing this off of Watt's, I believe it was dissertation. I think he was a PhD student in Texas.
Mhm.
And that paper, do you remember, Marcus? Was it out of the 60s maybe? It was
It
meant,
seem
we'll say it's
Yeah, it was
decades
definitely a while
ago.
back. We'll provide
Um,
it in the show notes.
but he spent a couple of years tagging with visually recognizable markers. I think he used patagial tags on birds so that he could identify individual males and females. So he had, Jakes, Jennies, Toms, and hens all marked with unique identifiers. And essentially, his graduate research project was driving around this ranch, or I think it was one large wildlife management area, and observing these individuals behaviorally and documenting their behavior. And he had these complicated, I'm sure you've looked at them, Marcus. He had these
Mhm.
complicated diagrams in the dissertation that showed the interrelationships and the dominance hierarchy for all these individuals and how they were related and how that changed over the course of the year, and even how there were these like subgroupings of smaller numbers of individuals that had their hierarchy, and then that group also had a hierarchy over other groups. So it was really fascinating work. But through those visual observations, and granted, put this in the right context. These were Rios. They're in
Mm-hmm.
a very open landscape, so we have some good reasons to believe that it also applies to other subspecies, but we don't know it with certainty. But he was able to document that larger groups of gobblers were more likely to secure breeding opportunities, but there was only one of the individuals within that group that would actually copulate with hens
Mm-hmm.
during the breeding season.
So the
And
dominant gobbler.
exactly. So that's what
Man, I
I'm
hear that a lot.
yeah. Yeah, and
People asking me about the dominant gobbler.
and I felt like Watts did a really good job of documenting it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's no replication, right? I'm not aware of any other study that's done that. Maybe there is one, but I feel like I would have found it by now. um,
Well, again, we've got some folks in the audience that are all about digging up some stuff
right.
and sending it to us. So if you
Yeah.
have it, send it on. We'll
Right.
cover it.
But what we don't know is when you remove that male, how does it change everything? Does male number 2 in the hierarchy come in the next day and start breeding those hens that otherwise would have been bred by male number 1? We don't know what the, time lag is there. We
Mm-hmm.
don't know if male number 2 is already fertile and just waiting for that opportunity, or if his fertility is behaviorally depressed or suppressed rather by male number 1, and it takes some time for his hormone cascade to kick into effect and for him to start actually producing sperm. And so that was one of the key questions that kind of led to this fertility aspect of the study. And one thing that I think this really interesting that I recalled from that Watts paper too was that that speaks to this a little bit. But remember, this is just one single behavioral observation
Mm-hmm.
where he was out there watching these birds, and apparently they had become really acclimated to him over time. Like I said, he spent I think 2 solid years in the field. You know the story I'm about to tell?
I'm pretty sure, but go ahead.
So he set up a hen decoy that I think was very realistic. That they had actually skinned out an actual hen and basically
Mm-hmm.
taxidermied this decoy, and she was in a breeding position. And there were a group of toms that came up, and the dominant tom bred her or attempted to, but then he realized that something funky was going on. He'd been catfished by this hen, and so he eventually meanders off. And this was right beside the graduate student's truck, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then he meanders off and goes around to the other side of the truck, eating bugs or who knows what.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it was Tom number 2 or if we even know where he was in the hierarchy. He comes over there and he tries to breed that hen. And then meanwhile, Tom number
Soon,
1 makes it back around the side of the truck and comes up and flogs him for trying to do that.
yeah.
And
So as
so
soon as he was out of sight.
as soon as he was out of sight, and I just feel like if he was infertile at that point in time, he probably wouldn't have attempted it. But I don't know. I'm not a
Yeah.
reproductive physiologist.
Yeah. Maybe we should find one.
Yeah. Yeah.
There are people out there that call themselves something along those lines.
For sure.
So that is inspiring the hunter harvest reproductive
That's right.
ecology study. Okay.
That's right. And so the way that, and I was a little bit nervous when we came up with this study design. It was actually suggested to me by um, Tim Gothard, who's the director of Alabama Wildlife Federation, because when we started talking about how to collect enough of these males to actually get samples to assess fertility, I had a lot of concern that it was going to be overly expensive for graduate students to travel around the state to try to pick up hundreds of birds. I mean, it's just
Mm-hmm.
logistically challenging and
Is that
super
what your target sample size was?
potentially super expensive. Yeah, I started out. I actually put together a power analysis, and I can't remember what effect size I set it up to detect at that time. But it led to me coming up with a targeted sample size of 300 birds. That was
Okay.
our initial target
Per year.
per year. That's right. And I was a little bit concerned about how we were going to get it done. And like I said, the director of AWF suggested to me that we crowdsource this. And so what we ended up doing is we came up with a model where we have a group of about 30-ish team leaders from around the state, is what we call them. They're all avid turkey hunters with a pretty extensive network of fellow turkey hunters, and they serve as the collection point. So all the hunters under their umbrella bring birds back to them, and then they're a central hub for the graduate students. Kevin Ostrander is the one that's leading that aspect of the research. And I should
That's
have
the grad
mentioned,
student. Okay.
yeah. And then I should have mentioned earlier that Matt Day is the student that's leading the song meter work. But so they serve as a collection point, and so Kevin can just travel around instead of to, 200 hunters. Actually, I can tell you how many hunters we had last year. We had 280 individual hunters that participated. So instead of traveling around to 280 individual hunters to pick up birds, he only had to go to 33.
That's really cool.
And it worked out, and it, I think, is a testament to the dedication that, those participants have to the wild turkey resource. Because, I mean, we were trying to, they could take all the harvestable portions of the bird. They could take the beard, they could take the spurs, they could eat the legs, they could eat the breast, all that stuff. We basically just needed the internal organs.
Yeah.
But we did ask
Which most
them,
folks aren't eating those.
most folks. We're going to take save the legs a step further next year.
Yeah. Save the liver.
The first thing that came to mind for me was save the eggs, but we already talked about we don't need to kill hens, so
yeah. Well, they get gizzards and gizzards and livers.
I ate a lot of gizzards and livers growing up, but they were from chickens, not turkeys.
Yeah, I've eaten my fair share. I'm not really a big fan of the livers, but I do like a gizzard.
I kind of do too.
Gizzard. It's a good thing to eat.
I'm not too
highbrow. Tried it.
I'm not too highbrow to admit it.
Yeah, I ate that a bunch growing up.
So
I just want to reiterate, that's really impressive and inspiring. I get frustrated sometimes about the hunters versus hunters thing. I feel like that goes on a lot online. I mean, one of our negative comments actually has insinuated that I'm anti-hunting. And that's really frustrating to me.
They're on to you.
Well, as someone who literally grew up hunting and then I've dedicated my life, as you have, to basically trying to learn about the resource and do things from a conservation perspective sustainably so that we can hunt, because I'm obsessed with hunting, and that has inspired me to do all of this with my life. And then that's the comment that gets thrown onto a thing because I think in that case it was because I brought up the idea that a hunter walking next to a hen on the nest could bump the hen. In one of the episodes, and it's like, how does that anyway? I feel like we have a lot of conversations that end up being hunters against hunters, and this is really inspiring because this is a bunch of really passionate people about the resource, and they're going out of their way to help you collect some really awesome information that's really important for the conservation of the turkeys.
Yeah.
And that is hunter driven and and hunter led, because you're a hunter. Like I just love that. And I think we should all take a moment to think about how can we come together like that instead of us being against each other. We may disagree on some issues about how we should go about things, but we're all in this for turkeys.
Yeah.
Or we should be. You need to reflect on that and think about your actions, and are you actually doing things that reflect you caring about the resource?
Yeah, that's right.
So I reflect on that a lot.
And these guys were making a sacrifice because they were driving around, either their buddy was bringing the bird to them that they didn't necessarily have to do. We all know how it is after you kill a bird. I mean, you want to get it taken care of and put away, and then you got to go to work, or you got to go pick up your kid, just a million different things. Yep. Your wife's already fussing at you because it's a Saturday and you've spent, all the past few Saturdays away from home.
That never happens at my house.
But it's an added layer of complication and time requirement to take the bird, back to your team leader. And then for the team leaders, man, I had guys, barking at me all the time about I'm running out of freezer space. I'm running out of freezer space. And I'm like, just hold tight. We're coming, we're getting there.
Yeah,
So
on the
I can
way.
only imagine that they had their, part of their chest freezer filled up, and then they may have had their freezer in their house. Their wife opens the
Yeah,
door and there's, this
there's feet everywhere.
this clean, and it's not, yeah, and it's like got wings on it and everything, feathers on it and everything still,
Yeah,
feet on it.
yeah, with the gut
and,
and guts in,
and
because
guts
that's what you
in
need.
and guts in. So, I mean,
Yeah,
it wasn't a small
I can
sacrifice for them to do this.
I can see
Um,
how that would go over at my house.
yeah,
Open up the freezer and we've got a bunch of, basically picked clean carcasses full of
yeah,
guts.
yeah,
Actually, that's actually relatively normal around the house for things like that to happen. So I guess
it
it
is in
would
ours
probably
too.
be fine.
Yeah. So,
So that's kind of interesting to think about, but it does speak again to the, it's a testament to
mhm,
dedication,
that's right.
and that's one thing the turkey community has.
That's right.
There are some really dedicated people.
Yeah. So we got 420 birds last year.
420 in the first year.
That's right. And
Wow!
they came from 49 Alabama counties.
Out of how many?
Oh, Marcus, you grew up in Alabama. You're supposed to know this trivia.
Well, not everybody in the audience did.
Take a guess. We got birds from 49 counties. How many do you think there are in Alabama?
My instinct is to say there's 56 or 50.
Oh, 67.
Oh, okay.
Not too far off.
Yeah.
Not too far off. So that's 73% of the counties represented, um, and we were really really happy with that sample size. And so we're not only collecting testes from each of these birds, um, but we're collecting a whole lot of other data as well. But I do have some preliminary data on the testes to share if you're interested
Mm.
in that.
You have preliminary data on
Mm-hmm.
testes from
Mm-hmm.
turkeys.
I see.
I think I'm confident that our audience needs to hear about this.
Yeah, I see that I've piqued your interest.
Yes. Interest peaked. Tell us what happened.
So eventually, where we're going to get to is we're working with a histopathologist here at Auburn University, that is going to, for brevity's sake, perform her magic and get us really detailed data on things like actual sperm counts, right, that are
Mm-hmm.
associated with fertility. But as a first cut, we can go back to the literature, and there were several studies from a few decades ago that established mass thresholds for turkey testes that give you some indication of the likelihood of fertility for each of these birds that they're taken from.
Mm-hmm.
And so, looking at those mass thresholds, just comparing to the published data, there were 10% of the adult males that we sampled last year that were likely, high probability, they were infertile.
Wait, 10% were infertile.
Yes, 10% had testes with a mass that was correlated in those prior studies with infertility.
Okay, how many of those were Jake's?
None.
Okay, so
These are all
10% of the adult males had
yes.
a mass, so a weight, that was below the threshold you would expect for a fertile male.
That's right.
Okay,
So in those
so that
prior
means 90% of them, based on that data, are probably fertile.
well, there's two more splits in the mass. Okay, so or I should guess I should say thresholds. So there's another. So you go up above that threshold into the next category, and that was categorized in the prior literature as usually fertile. Okay,
Okay.
there's a band that's usually fertile between, I don't remember the exact numbers, mass X and mass Y, and 50% of our birds fell into that category of usually fertile. And then the third cut is the mass above which birds were always fertile in those previous study, and 41% of the testes from the gobblers that we collected last year met that criteria. So kind of in summary, we had 90% of our birds that could be either categorized as usually or always fertile, and 10% that were almost never fertile.
Well,
So
that's interesting.
the
So either your sample, I mean, I think we could probably assume this isn't the case, but I'm assuming that everybody wasn't killing the dominant gobbler.
probably not.
Probably, I bet 9 out of 10 gobblers weren't dominant gobblers.
Why do you think that?
Why do I think that?
Yeah.
I mean, how many of the gobblers are dominant gobblers?
Oh, you're saying that there's no way that they're that successful at killing dominant I got you.
Well, I'm just saying, just by random chance, you would
Yes,
expect it to
exactly.
be a
Exactly.
far lower
Yeah.
rate of
Yeah.
the actual birds. I mean,
That's
I
right.
kill satellite birds and things that I would presume to not be the dominant gobbler commonly,
Yeah.
and I would assume that's the case.
Right. So where this greater resolution data that our histopathologist is going to be able to provide us with is going to come in handy is, confirmation that that bottom and that top tier are actually always fertile or never fertile, but more
Hmm.
importantly, that middle group that is usually fertile, being able to better distinguish, where
Yeah,
birds fall
which
out.
yeah,
Yeah.
were they fertile or not?
But the other valuable data point that we have for all these birds when it comes to fertility is all of the participating hunters were required to fill out a survey with each harvest, and they're including information on the bird's behavior from the time that they observed it to the time they harvested it. So we will have data that doesn't perfectly establish whether or not that bird was dominant or not, but we have some cues that would indicate that he would be.
Hmm.
And things like, was he strutting? Was he with other birds, and were the other birds strutting? Did you hear
Hmm.
him gobble? Did the other birds gobble? Other things as well, as like, did he come into a decoy, and what was the type of decoy? Was it a hen, or was it a
So you
strutter? Was
do.
it a
So,
jake?
so you even have some stuff on the hunting method.
Yeah, so we will be able to associate some of these fertility rates with the actual behavior that was observed in the field at the time of
Hmm.
harvest.
That is interesting on so many levels because now, I mean, we're getting asked all these questions about, which bird should I shoot? How many of them are fertile? I mean, I get those all the time.
Hmm.
Hunting methods,
Yeah.
you know, there's potentially a whole bunch of good stuff to unpack there, but we need somebody to look at those testes under the microscope and figure out the.
It ain't going to be me.
Yeah. Isn't that what you said on one of the previous episodes? And it got me tickled. Something about looking at them through a microscope.
There's so many
So
jokes to be made here, but I'm trying to keep this family friendly if you're listening with your
yeah,
kids. So,
yeah. Well, definitely really exciting data and interesting already just with the preliminary stuff. But of course, you know, we need to rein it in before we
hmm
assume that we know what the
yeah,
results are going to be,
that's right.
because that's what the next step is, to
Yeah, that's
really
right.
iron that out.
And, another important thing to keep in mind too is that even if the data stay consistent with the trend that we've already observed based on those results I just shared, what we still don't know is just because a bird is fertile, whether or not he's getting breeding opportunity.
Hmm.
Just
Yeah, really, what it tells you is he capable if he gets an opportunity,
exactly. That's right. That's right.
which I think is important because that's a part of the discussion, is whether or not the other ones, that if you shoot the dominant gobbler, could the other ones take over?
hmm
And it sounds like preliminarily from this evidence that a large portion of them probably can.
Yes. Physiologically,
Yeah,
maybe not behaviorally.
right. Well,
Um,
I think, I mean, we have, this is a stepwise process, and
that's
we're
right. That's right.
building on everybody's work, and
Well,
this
it's
is an important piece of that.
I typically, I've never done a project on reproductive ecology of any species in the past, but this is the reproductive ecology of wild turkeys, and especially the limited understanding that we have of it merits this type of work. I thought it was important
Hmm.
enough to get involved in and branch out, and we were luckily able to put together a team that had the expertise to do that. So it
I'm
excites me as
surprised.
well.
I'm surprised in your questionnaire you didn't ask them like what proportion of the landscape is foreblend and
I think
yeah,
I,
it's already
I think I
enough burden on people to try to get them to do what you've already got them to do.
I think I did, Marcus. I did have put one habitat question in there. I asked him.
Oh
I
yes,
asked him
that see
the cover
you're
type
holding
the
back
bird
on
was
us.
harvested in. I just had to.
Yeah.
I don't I don't know how to. I mean, it's like when you're standing there looking at a carcass in a necropsy lab. I'm like, how do I get habitat data off this bird?
Yeah. Well, what
But
else are you doing with the birds? I
man,
mean, is that all you're doing?
we're squeezing everything that we can out of these carcasses. So we'll be sending off disease samples with particular emphasis on histaminiasis and LPDV, which we've talked about a little bit before on the podcast. And so we're
Yeah.
trying to document the prevalence and distribution of those diseases throughout Alabama. And then one that I think is really going to pique your interest is that we're also preserving samples that will be sent to some collaborators at Michigan State University to their toxicology lab, and we're going to be testing for exposure to neonicotinoid pesticides.
Yeah. That has been a really common concern.
Yeah.
As you know, I did a kind of a mini literature review, and I found a paper recently published on turkeys showing that I don't remember the proportions. I shared it on Instagram and Facebook. I don't remember the proportion of turkeys, but neonics were detected in the
Hmm.
turkeys in some gobblers, and that was in Ontario. And some of them, or at least one of them, I think it was a couple of them, were at a level that has been shown to have negative effects in other game birds during challenge studies. We
Yeah.
don't have any data on that for turkeys, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Like, this is the first step is to determine
It
whether or
is.
not you see, like, are the residues in the
Yeah.
turkeys, and if then the next step is to figure out if the levels that you find when you do result in some sort of problem that
Right.
that those are multiple steps down the road. But the first study that I have seen on turkeys did show that they are exposed to it, at least in that site in Ontario where they did that
Yeah.
study.
Yeah.
That was also hunter generated data,
Right.
which is pretty cool.
Hunters
But
giving back to conservation.
yeah, so
Um,
there's a bunch of work on this with the various game bird species. One out of South Dakota that was pretty interesting, and several out of Europe from different game bird species. We are planning to do a multi-part series, and I think one of the
mhm.
episodes will be on this that's related to feeding and other aspects of management that we should be thinking about. So okay, so you're surveying the carcasses for the neonics, but
Yeah.
you don't have that data. Sounds like
So we've
so.
got the fertility analysis, we've got the disease analysis, we've got the neonic testing. I don't have any preliminary results from either of those second or third objectives. And then lastly, I've got an undergraduate student, Mary Wells, who is going through the crop contents of all these hunter harvested birds. And what I'm particularly interested in looking at is compared to studies that were conducted decades ago, and in fact, there haven't been many turkey diet studies that I'm aware
Mm-hmm.
of published in the recent literature. But comparing back to those food habit studies from decades ago, and there is one that's directly from Alabama. I'm
Mm-hmm.
really interested to see how food habits may or may not have changed over that time period, and if so, are there clear patterns that would indicate to us that certain plants have decreased in representation in a way that you would expect would be associated with land use changes and
Mm-hmm.
land management changes, and maybe others have become more prevalent associated with those same changes.
Mm-hmm.
And then
Well,
also,
and not even just plants. You could also potentially see the relative contribution of bugs in their diet.
yes, and they have habitat associations as well that you could make maybe some
Mm-hmm.
inferences about. And then, of course, we've had declines in certain species, both plants and invertebrate animals that turkeys would consume. and then we've had introductions of new exotic
Mhm.
species across the landscape. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to see, how the prevalence of those food items and the representation of various taxa has changed over time, and how that could have, certain implications for the energy expenditure that turkeys have to put out to consume those food items,
Mhm.
as well as you and I were talking about earlier this morning, the calorie density and the macronutrient composition of the diet now versus then as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that's another one of those things that, man, that's good stuff right there. Like, you've already got published information on what turkeys ate back in the day,
Hmm.
decades ago, and
Right.
now you're getting another really good sample. I guess you're probably getting another year of
Yeah.
400 plus.
Yeah.
So you're going to have a huge sample size of these.
We anticipate we'll have about 500 birds this year, probably.
Yeah. So, we're getting up close to 1,000 individuals that you might have all these different data types on.
That's right.
That's pretty remarkable. And then that diet, man, that one's resonating with me.
Well,
I'm excited
especially
to see about that.
especially with how much we've talked about early. And man, I know there's probably tired of hearing this by now, but the decline of early successional cover types, early successional
Yeah.
plant communities across the landscape, I'd be very surprised if that's not reflected in the diet. Um, Now, maybe birds are still consuming the plants that are associated with those areas at the same rate that they were historically, but if so, given that we know it's not really well quantified yet, but we know that that cover type has decreased to some extent, it could be that they're having to put out more energy to require it, even if it's present in the same amounts.
Hmm. You mean present in the diet, but so in
If it's
other
present,
words,
yeah,
it's present in the diet in the same amount, but it's so
they had to
far.
work harder
Yeah, there's
to
so
get
much
it.
more or so much less of it on the landscape.
Yeah,
They have to work more
that's right.
to get the same amount in the diet.
That's
That's
right.
interesting. Man, that's going to be good stuff and very insightful. We've talked all about how much things have changed
Hmm.
and from various aspects, but that's a pretty good indicator of how the turkey's diet, could reflect
Hmm.
things that have changed for the turkey, and some of them we may not really appreciate have changed
Right.
to the degree they have.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
So that's most of my ongoing work right now. The only other thing that I can think of to cover that we skipped over earlier is we were talking about the gobbling aspect of the study. We went into a lot of detail on the habitat associations with gobbling activity.
Mm-hmm.
What I didn't speak to as much is chronology. The timing of gobbling across the state, and we haven't conducted any formal analysis on that yet. But we have put together some figures with histograms,
Mm-hmm.
showing you stratified by North, Central, and South Alabama, and when the peaks occur and when they start to tail off.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't appear that there are any
There's no
any differences that
striking.
are going to be statistically different in terms of timing of gobbling from South Alabama to North Alabama. And given the deep dive that you and I recently took into the literature looking at nest timing, um, it's not really that surprising because even over when you consider going from Florida to Georgia to Tennessee or the Carolinas, I mean, you're really only talking about a week and a half difference, 2 week difference, maybe in some cases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really really interesting stuff. So you weren't. I mean, it was basically you're seeing the same thing. It sounds like across Alabama. There's no strong indicator that you have this really big difference in when
Right.
turkeys are gobbling, depending on where you're at in the state. Like they just
Yeah.
seem to all be gobbling about the same time.
Yeah. And I mean, for people that aren't, really that familiar with Alabama's landscape and composition, it's a very diverse state. I mean, we go all the way down from the Gulf Coast, on the Gulf of Mexico, all the way up to the Southern Appalachians. So we've got a lot of diversity, and it tends to be a relatively, tall state latitudinally. So that's a lot of ground to cover. I don't know,
Hmm.
Marcus. What would you say? It's probably several hundred miles from North to South Alabama, probably about
Yeah,
300
it,
miles or so.
definitely is several hundred. Yeah. Well, we had a study. I was an author on it, but I wasn't really a part of the study until it was already almost completed in Mississippi, and we did find a little bit
Hmm.
of change from
Yeah,
north to south Mississippi, but it wasn't as striking as I was expecting.
that's the Palumbo study, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So
and I
we
don't know
published
why.
that a couple.
And I don't know why that is. I mean, there was a methodological difference there,
Yeah.
because they were using all human observers to do
Mm-hmm.
point traditional bird point counts, and they did find that difference. One of the things that has been discussed is maybe they didn't have enough data because they were limited to human observers versus using ARUs. But
Yeah.
you would think, though, that with as your number of observations becomes smaller or more limited, that your ability to detect a statistical difference in timing would actually decrease. Yet they still did
Yeah.
find a statistical difference.
Right.
But
And
here we are in Alabama not finding one, and I know Mike has reported the same thing elsewhere.
yeah. Well, the other thing is, you know, some of the mathematical approaches in that study were pretty intense.
Hmm.
Guiming Wang
Yeah,
was one of the co-authors, and I mean, an analytical genius.
yeah, sure.
And I know that some of, I mean, that's another potential thing is some of the analytical approaches that were
Yeah,
used were a really good fit for that data, and they may not be in some of these other studies. Which
yeah,
again, you haven't even analyzed yours, so I guess.
right. Yeah.
But
So we're
even so, when you looked at that Palumbo data set, you didn't even need all that modeling to see that there was likely something going on there.
hmm
Like it didn't, I've seen the graphs that you've produced, just kind of summarizing it, and it doesn't look like there's anything there.
yeah. And if y'all want to check that out, it's nice, I think blue, yellow, and red figure. It pops out pretty strongly. If you scroll through looking at my Instagram post, you'll find it there pretty easily.
Okay, maybe you should just run all these posts that you've done previously as stories when this comes out.
Yeah, that'd be a good
And
idea.
make it easy for folks. I think about that sometimes because I say the same thing. I posted something about it, and then it's like, well, they're
Right.
gonna go dig through 100
Nobody's going
posts.
to go through that. I mean, maybe one or two people.
Yeah. Well, what about? So you said that you had the sound boxes on private and public land.
That's right.
Is there anything striking
Yeah.
that you can talk about on that? I know
I
that.
guess, striking differences in data, but not at all unintuitive that magnitude of gobbling is much greater on private lands.
Okay.
I mean, that's, in line with what our expectation would be. And we specifically, and this is an important methodological detail that I should have made clear earlier, is that maybe I did mention it, that we specifically chose large, intensively managed for turkeys, private lands to include in our song meter sample because, you know, just for the very reason that we were interested in documenting, how do populations perform on these areas where we think everything is in place compared to how our population is performing on areas that are more of the status quo, right? So we were
Mm-hmm.
interested in that contrast. So most of these properties are at least 1,000 acres in size. They have limited hunting pressure. We're collecting data on that too, so we will be able to associate hunting intensity and hunting pressure with gobbling activity as well. But you contrast that type of property with a wildlife management area that gets a lot of pressure. You not only have less gobbling activity on that public land because more birds are being taken off of it, so there's just fewer left on the landscape to gobble. But we know that hunting pressure also affects gobbling activity as well among the
Mm-hmm.
remaining birds.
Right. So many questions. I always wonder too about the chronology.
Yeah,
Like, well, if you're shooting the gobbling birds early, then does that affect the chronology that you would see on that? So in other words, like if
Yeah.
we have this intense hunting pressure up
Yeah.
front, that's select, and I don't even think we have that data either, right? To
Yeah.
know that's the case, I just know intuitively as a hunter, the one that's gobbling his face off is the one I'm more likely to get on.
Absolutely.
So, assuming that that applies here, I wonder how much, there's so many questions about this
But you
kind of
would
stuff, which is
expect in
reason we
this.
need lots of approaches.
That's right. But you would expect in my particular circumstance with this data set, that it would be, that decrease in gobbling activity influenced by hunting would be pretty similar across study areas, just because they're being hunted the same way.
Well, I know, but I'm talking about just in general.
Yeah.
Like we're saying, okay, this is what the goblin chronology looks like,
Yeah.
not comparing it across your gradient, but just like
Right.
talking about when it is.
Oh,
And I wonder
yeah.
how much that
Well,
is being
yeah,
influenced just
sure.
by hunting.
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, even on those lightly hunted private lands, you can put a vertical bar. You can break it down, the data set out by site, and I could say, like Joe's turkey camp. I can put a vertical bar on that histogram of gobbling activity where the season starts, and magnitude drops off pretty quickly. Now,
Do you think
that
that's a result of the hunting?
I think it's an interaction between removal of gobblers. So, you kill a gobbler that's roosting next to one of these ARUs on a regular basis, you're not going to have as many gobbles there. But I think that there's also some birds that are still alive that are responding to that pressure and gobbling less.
Okay,
Now,
you put
the
me on the spot about details, and you know that my recognition. I mean, for when I was in high school, I had to learn the name of all the counties in Alabama, and I still didn't remember how many there were. So like I don't remember details like that, but I got one. I think it's probably on the mind of a few listeners out there. How many gobbles a day are we talking about?
oh man, yeah, you put me on
Like
the spot and I failed on that
your
one.
sound box. Like how many is it catching per day on average?
You put me on the spot and I failed on that one.
And then a follow up question to that. While I can see you're digging around looking through your papers, how many gobbles have you captured on one
Yeah,
in a day?
that's a good
Because
question.
I'm one of those people, I need to hear like 200 gobbles.
I don't have the summary data right here at my fingertips. I do know that we had a private land site that, because we'll go out and we're collecting these data, and Mike and his graduate students have developed this basically software that helps us cut down on having to listen through all that
Mhm.
footage. It flags likely gobbles, and so we ship them over to the UGA guys, and it's been Mike's, I think now postdoc. He was his former PhD student, Patrick Whiteman, that's
Mhm.
been running all that for us. And so he'll run it through the system, send it back to my grad student so that he can go back through and verify each of those points in the recording that are flagged as a likely gobble. So we have,
Mhm.
it's a pretty painstaking process. But when Patrick sent one of the ones back from one of our sites this year, I think he was pretty floored. He had never seen anything like it. I mean, they were they were burning it down on that site.
Like hundreds of gobbles, or how many are
Uh,
we talking about in a day?
man, it's been months since we got that data back. I think we had some sites that had 100 gobbles at least in a day at one site.
Mhm.
You know, I think there may have been some that were a few hundred.
What time frame are you recording? Is it all day or is it just in the morning?
1 hour before sunrise to 5 hours after.
Okay, so you're capturing probably the vast
Hmm.
majority.
Yeah,
So, but it's not all day.
and we used to, and I say we, I didn't do it at this point in time, but before guys like Mike that do a lot of this work had developed the software to cut down on processing time, we restricted it way more down to a window of about, a half hour before sunrise to 1 hour after, because they were having to manually go through and listen to
Mhm.
every second of those recordings. But he subsequently, has expanded that out more and more to capture, an increasing duration throughout the day,
Mhm.
since they can cut down on that processing time.
Yeah. That's good to know. Well, I think I have. Well, I know that I can think of one time where I counted the number of gobbles, and I don't remember exactly how many it was,
Yeah.
but it was like 160 or something like that. That
Yeah.
I was just in a listening spot, and that was on public land. I'm not going
Yeah.
to drop a pin for you, but that is one of my go-to spots. It actually is the spot that I took Chris Moorman. He's going to tell a little hunting story here soon. We've got him on the docket. And the story that he's going to tell everybody about his first turkey hunting experience with me.
That's going to be fun.
That was in that spot that I heard all those gobbles. So I remember that was like the record morning. It was like 160 something. But
160 gobbles.
So
you
what
sure,
else?
You sure you can't send me that?
That point?
That pin?
Well, we killed all of them now. No, I'm just kidding. That was like 10 years ago. Yeah, that was on public land, and it was like a week before the season came in, and I was just trying to see where everybody was, and it was a pretty impressive morning. It was one of those that they just burned it down.
So you sharing that story brought me bought me some time to dig up my data. And so
I could have given you some more detail if I'd known that.
That particular site that I was talking about that was so good, we had a 2-week window where the average number of gobbles per recorder per week was 400 to 450.
So for the week.
And so that's including, both cloudy, rainy, windy days and bluebird days.
So you're, 50, 60 gobbles a day? I can't do that mental math that quick. We've already established I'm not good at math. Okay. That's getting it right there.
Yeah. 4 to 5 is like 400 to 500 a week per unit on average.
Yeah.
So that not only factors in those days that are poor you get poor gobbling activity, but it's also factoring in that some of the units aren't in good areas too.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some that are much higher than that.
Yeah. Can you see what was the highest one?
I have that, but I don't have it pulled up at my fingertips now.
Well, do I need to tell another story? Story time. That's really cool. That's the kind of stuff that the little tidbits sometimes that resonate with people.
Oh,
They just appreciate.
Yeah.
You've got a bunch of these boxes sitting all over the landscape listening to gobbles for you.
Yeah. And fun fact for the listeners, the gobbles that you hear during the intro and the outro to each episode are actually from one of these units.
We recorded those in the field during your project.
Yeah.
And then used those in the podcast.
Yeah.
And you know what? I will say, and maybe some folks out there want to comment on it to us about what they think, but every time I hear that intro gobble, it just like gives me chills.
Yeah. When you hear the woodpecker, and then you just hear pow.
I tell you what, it's every time. My lab does a whole bunch of camera work, and we have a lot of cameras on the landscape now on video, so we're just getting really cool data. And every time I get sent one, my students know now. If I get a turkey, it needs to be in my inbox.
Yeah.
And every time they send me one and I open it up and a big strutter comes walking through or something, I melt. It's
same
every time.
You know what makes that even worse is when you're going through the Instagram reels and people set it to music.
Mm-hmm.
And it makes it even that much more dramatic. It takes it up to a 11 out of 10.
Yeah. Turn it up to 11. Well, you what was it? Recently, you shared a post about that prescribed fire you were doing the other day.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that sound was that you had in there, but man, that got me a little bit amped.
I know.
It was power.
That's exactly why I used it, because scrolling through reels, like that one popped up a few times, and I was like, man, I love it. And it was from Peaky Blinders. I don't know if you've ever watched that show on Netflix, but
No, I haven't, but I saw that. I looked at the, what the sound was, so that I'd know.
Yeah, it was a pretty good show. I haven't kept it. We're going off in the weeds for real now.
Hey, weeds or poult cover?
No,
cover.
No, there's definitely no one listening at this point.
Yeah, we've lost them. Well, are there any other things to give an update on from the Alabama work? I mean, I know you got your hands on a lot of stuff going on. It's really good stuff.
That's the bulk of it for right now.
Cool. Well, thanks for giving us some insight into it. As I was saying, it dawned on us that we should go ahead and give some updates on what we're doing. We've been focused on giving updates on what everybody else is doing and haven't really talked about some of the work that we've got going on. So we'll do the same here in the near future, hopefully on the Florida work. But really cool to see all this going on. Man, I'm really excited about those hunter killed birds you have. Man, you got a gold mine of data that's going to be really, really good.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like turkeys. Every time we turn around, there's one more bit of data that we can extract out of them too.
Yeah.
Like,
do one you thing still I didn't have even... them? Because I had a couple.
So, all right. Well, maybe you'll have me back on someday.
Yeah. Well, normally we tell people, can you let us know where to find you or if anybody has questions, but we've already ironed that out. It's in the show notes.
That's right.
If you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out. We're still getting a lot of great feedback and we're trying to sprinkle in information based on that feedback like we did in this episode. So please keep it coming.
We are having an increasingly difficult time keeping up with messages lately.
Yeah,
so
and I view that as a real success.
Yeah.
Like it's probably frustrating on the other end of that.
Sure.
But, I mean, that's kind of cool that we're getting so much feedback that we can't keep up now. That tells me there's a lot of people that are enjoying the content and that appreciate what we're trying to do and that have questions and they're thinking and care about the resource and all that's really awesome. I love that. Again, if you want to help us share this, rate the podcast if you haven't done so already, help us by doing those things. We really appreciate all of it. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
And all I'm thinking about right now, and I don't know when this episode is dropping, but I'm thinking about going turkey hunting next week.
Come on now.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.